They said the most dangerous man in New York had everything money could buy, yet not a single woman had ever made him stop long enough to truly look at her, until one ordinary laugh slipped through the silence of his mansion and reached a place no power ever had. Every employee inside Romano Manor understood the rules before they even signed the paperwork. Keep your eyes down. Speak only when spoken to. Never ask questions. Above all, never mistake kindness for familiarity. Gabriel Romano preferred efficiency over conversation, schedules over celebrations, and silence over noise. His mansion reflected the man himself, polished marble stretching beneath crystal chandeliers, dark walnut walls lined with priceless paintings, every clock perfectly synchronized, as if even time feared disappointing its owner. Housekeepers moved quietly through endless hallways like gentle shadows. Chefs communicated with nods instead of chatter. Security staff spoke in calm voices that never echoed. Even the morning sunlight seemed careful as it spilled across the floor-to-ceiling windows, warming expensive furniture without disturbing the stillness that ruled the estate. Naomi Carter noticed the silence the moment she stepped through the front entrance on her first day. It wasn't peaceful. It was practiced. Every smile looked rehearsed. Every greeting ended too quickly. She adjusted the simple name tag pinned to her uniform and reminded herself why she was here. Her mother's medical bills weren't going to disappear on their own, and the second job she'd worked at a neighborhood bakery no longer covered enough rent. This position offered stability, health insurance, and a chance to breathe again. That alone made every intimidating hallway worth walking. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, the head housekeeper, guided Naomi through the mansion with quiet precision, explaining schedules, supply closets, and cleaning assignments before stopping outside an elegant breakfast room. Her expression became even more serious. "Mr. Romano has breakfast at exactly 7:30 every morning," she whispered. "Everything runs on time. We don't interrupt him, and we certainly don't react to anything he says." Naomi blinked. "React?" Mrs. Brooks hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Romano occasionally tells jokes." Naomi waited for the rest. None came. The older woman simply sighed as if years of experience had taught her that explanation was impossible. Inside the dining room, Gabriel Romano sat alone at a table long enough to seat 20 people. His charcoal suit looked perfectly tailored despite the early hour, his dark coffee untouched beside a neatly folded newspaper. Without lifting his eyes, he made one quiet observation about the weather being so predictable that even his calendar had stopped pretending to be surprised. The room remained completely still. One assistant offered a polite smile that disappeared almost immediately. A server lowered his head. No one laughed. Naomi, carrying a tray of fresh fruit she had been asked to deliver, heard the remark just as she stepped through the doorway. Before she could stop herself, a genuine laugh escaped her lips, warm, bright, and completely unplanned. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply honest. The sound floated across polished marble, through crystal light, and into a mansion that had forgotten what spontaneous joy sounded like. Every movement in the room froze. Mrs. Brooks quietly closed her eyes. Somewhere a silver spoon rested against fine china with the softest click. Gabriel Romano slowly looked up from his newspaper. For the first time in longer than anyone inside that house could remember, he wasn't looking through someone. He was looking directly at her. Naomi stood perfectly still, her cheeks warming as the silence settled over the breakfast room. She had laughed without thinking, the same way she always had when someone reminded her of home, and only now did she realize that everyone else looked as though she had broken an unwritten law. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks lowered her eyes toward the polished floor, clearly expecting the young housekeeper to be dismissed before the morning coffee had even cooled. The assistants remained frozen beside the walls, carefully avoiding Gabriel Romano's expression as though looking at him might somehow make the moment worse. Gabriel folded his newspaper with deliberate precision and rested it beside his untouched cup. His blue-gray eyes remained fixed on Naomi, not with anger, but with quiet curiosity. It was an unfamiliar expression, one that even the employees who had served him for years struggled to recognize. "What exactly was funny?" he asked in a calm voice that carried through the enormous room without effort. Naomi swallowed and tightened her grip on the silver tray. "I am sorry, sir," she answered honestly. "I did not mean to interrupt breakfast." Gabriel repeated the question, neither raising his voice nor showing irritation. What was funny? Naomi hesitated before allowing herself a small smile. My father used to tell jokes like that. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then Gabriel glanced toward the newspaper again before asking another unexpected question. Did people laugh? Naomi nodded. Every single time. One of the assistants looked genuinely confused. Another subtly shifted his weight, unable to understand why the conversation had not already ended. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, considering her answer more carefully than anyone expected. Even when the joke was terrible, Naomi could not help smiling again, especially when it was terrible. The corners of Gabriel's mouth almost changed before returning to their usual calm expression. It was so brief that Naomi wondered if she had imagined it. You may continue with your work, he said quietly. Thank you for answering honestly. Naomi thanked him and walked from the room with measured steps, refusing to look behind her until the heavy doors closed softly. Only then did she release the breath she had been holding. Mrs. Brooks caught up with her halfway down the hallway, looking equal parts relieved and astonished. I have worked here for 12 years, she whispered. Do you know how many conversations like that I have witnessed? Naomi shook her head. None. They continued toward the service corridor where the atmosphere immediately became lighter. Kitchen staff exchanged puzzled glances after hearing rumors of what had happened upstairs. A young pastry chef quietly asked whether Mr. Romano had actually spoken to the new housekeeper for more than one sentence. Nobody could quite believe it. Meanwhile, inside his private dining room, Gabriel remained seated long after breakfast should have ended. His coffee had gone cold, but he barely noticed. Instead, his thoughts drifted back to the sound that had echoed through the mansion only minutes earlier. It had not been forced politeness or nervous laughter meant to satisfy a powerful employer. It had been genuine, effortless, and completely free of calculation. He realized something that surprised even him. For years, people had listened to every word he spoke because they feared disappointing him. Naomi Carter had listened because she had simply been herself. And somehow, in a house where every conversation felt carefully measured, that single honest laugh lingered longer than any business meeting, any compliment, or any carefully rehearsed conversation he could remember. The rhythm of Romano Manor returned to its familiar silence, but something invisible had shifted beneath the polished routines. Naomi spent the next several days dusting library shelves, arranging fresh flowers, polishing antique picture frames, and folding linen with the same quiet diligence she brought to every task. She avoided the main staircase whenever possible and never lingered outside Gabriel Romano's office. As far as she was concerned, the unusual breakfast conversation belonged in the past. She had a job to protect and responsibilities waiting beyond the mansion's gates. Every Friday evening, she drove 45 minutes to visit her mother, bringing groceries, fresh fruit, and whatever homemade bread the kitchen staff allowed her to take home. She never complained about the long hours because every paycheck carried another piece of hope. What Naomi did not realize was that someone had begun noticing the smallest details about her routine. Gabriel found himself recognizing the sound of her footsteps before he ever saw her. Unlike everyone else, she never hurried simply because he entered a room. She worked carefully, greeting people with quiet respect whether they were executives, gardeners, or delivery drivers. She thanked the kitchen staff after every meal, remembered the maintenance supervisor's birthday without writing it down, and once spent nearly 20 minutes helping an elderly florist carry heavy boxes through the service entrance instead of leaving the task to someone else. None of those moments were dramatic enough for anyone to mention, yet Gabriel somehow noticed every one of them. It puzzled him. During meetings with investors, he could remember financial projections down to the last decimal point. Yet lately, he found himself recalling the sound of one honest laugh instead. Late one afternoon, while reviewing contracts in his study, he heard gentle laughter drifting through the open French doors leading toward the rear courtyard. Without thinking, he stood and walked to the window. Below, Naomi knelt beside the estate gardener, an older gentleman named Harold who had worked on the grounds for nearly 3 decades. Harold held up an unusually shaped tomato from the greenhouse with complete seriousness, insisting it looked exactly like the state of Texas. Naomi laughed so warmly that even Harold began laughing at his own joke. Gabriel watched as she accepted the oddly shaped tomato with both hands as though it were a priceless gift instead of an imperfect vegetable. She thanked Harold with genuine appreciation before continuing toward the staff kitchen. No audience, no performance, just simple gratitude. Gabriel remained standing at the window long after both of them disappeared from view. He could not remember the last time anyone inside the estate had laughed without worrying who might overhear. The realization stayed with him throughout the evening. At dinner, one of his senior advisors attempted a carefully rehearsed compliment about the mansion's flawless operation. Gabriel barely listened. His attention drifted toward the hallway where staff quietly moved between rooms. For years he had believed discipline created excellence. Now he began wondering whether discipline, without warmth, simply created distance. The question lingered in his thoughts long after the meeting ended. Meanwhile, Naomi finished her shift, changed into a simple denim jacket, and stepped outside beneath a soft orange sunset that painted the sky above Manhattan. She smiled to herself while remembering Harold's ridiculous tomato comparison, never imagining that the most observant man she had ever met was slowly discovering something he had overlooked for years. It was not grand speeches, expensive gifts, or perfect appearances that made a house feel alive. Sometimes it was one ordinary person who carried kindness so naturally that everyone around her remembered how to smile without permission. Monday mornings at Romano Manor had always followed the same precise rhythm, but by the beginning of Naomi Carter's second week, Gabriel Romano found himself making small changes that nobody could explain. Instead of leaving immediately after breakfast for his downtown office, he lingered for an extra 10 minutes, quietly reviewing documents that could easily have waited until later. His executive assistant noticed the adjustment, but wisely asked no questions. The drivers simply waited outside with the engines running while the mansion continued moving through its carefully choreographed routine. Naomi, completely unaware of the subtle change, was busy arranging fresh white lilies in the main foyer. She preferred working with flowers because they reminded her of Saturday mornings at her father's house. He had believed that every room deserved something alive inside it, even when money was tight. As she trimmed the stems and placed the final bloom into a crystal vase, she heard calm footsteps approaching across the marble floor. Looking up, she saw Gabriel walking through the foyer with a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm. She politely stepped aside to give him space. He slowed instead of continuing toward the front entrance. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Gabriel looked at the flowers and said with complete seriousness, "I suppose these lilies are here because they heard the Roses filed a complaint about working weekends." Naomi stared at him for one confused second before realizing he had actually intended it as a joke. A soft laugh escaped before she could stop herself. It was followed by another, brighter than the first, until she covered her mouth with embarrassment. "I am sorry," she said between gentle breaths. "That was unexpected." Gabriel tilted his head slightly. "Unexpected because it was clever?" Naomi smiled warmly. "Unexpected because only my father could tell jokes that sounded exactly like that." For the first time in years, Gabriel allowed the smallest hint of amusement to remain on his face instead of hiding it behind professional composure. It was not a broad smile. Most people would have missed it completely. Naomi did not. She noticed the tiny change around his eyes before he thanked her and continued toward the front doors. Behind the reception desk, two assistants exchanged silent glances. They had just witnessed something they would never have believed if someone else had described it. Later that afternoon, whispers quietly traveled through the employee dining room. Nobody exaggerated the story because nobody needed to. Every person who had seen the exchange described the same impossible detail. Mr. Romano had voluntarily started a conversation. Mrs. Brooks listened while pouring coffee into a ceramic mug, then simply shook her head with quiet disbelief. "Perhaps," she murmured, "some houses wait years for the right person to remind them they were built for living, not just existing." Upstairs, Gabriel sat alone inside his study, looking out through tall windows toward the gardens where autumn leaves drifted gently across perfectly trimmed grass. He opened a financial report, read the first page twice, and realized he had not absorbed a single number. Instead, he remembered Naomi's laughter echoing beneath the high ceilings, natural enough to fill every empty corner of the mansion without asking permission. He had spent years building an empire where every detail could be controlled, every meeting carefully planned, and every outcome calculated. Yet the brightest moment of his entire week had come from something no amount of money could arrange. It had come from one completely honest reaction that could never be purchased, rehearsed, or commanded. The following Saturday arrived with clear blue skies and crisp autumn air, the kind of morning that painted golden light across the windows of Romano Manor and made the gardens glow like a postcard. Naomi finished organizing the breakfast pantry before asking Mrs. Brooks for permission to leave an hour early. As she did every weekend, she planned to visit her mother in a quiet neighborhood nearly 50 miles outside Manhattan. Before leaving, she stopped by the employee kitchen where Harold was carefully watering a collection of herbs growing beside the windows. "Your mother will love these," he said, handing her a small bundle of fresh rosemary tied with simple twine. Naomi accepted it with genuine gratitude. "Thank you." She says fresh herbs make every meal taste like someone cared. Harold smiled warmly. "Your father taught you that too?" Naomi's expression softened as she nodded. "He taught me almost everything worth remembering." During the drive, familiar roads carried her back through years she could never forget. Her father, Daniel Carter, had worked as a city bus mechanic for nearly 30 years. He never considered himself a comedian, yet he insisted that every difficult day deserved at least one terrible joke. When the washing machine broke, he claimed it was simply taking a vacation. When heavy rain flooded the backyard, he announced they finally owned waterfront property. Every Thanksgiving turkey that came out a little too dry became, according to him, an opportunity to appreciate extra cranberry sauce. Naomi used to groan, roll her eyes, and laugh anyway because the jokes were never really about being funny. They were his way of protecting the people he loved from worrying too much. Even during the hardest months of his illness, he refused to let fear become the loudest voice in the house. He would point toward a hospital meal and whisper that at least the chef believed everyone deserved an unforgettable dining experience. Nurses laughed. Patients laughed. Most importantly, Naomi's mother laughed. Those memories remained brighter than every difficult day that followed. When Naomi arrived, her mother welcomed her with a long embrace inside the modest brick home where she had grown up. Together they cooked vegetable soup, sliced warm bread, and shared quiet conversation around the small oak kitchen table that Daniel had built by hand many years earlier. At one point her mother noticed Naomi smiling to herself while stirring the soup. "You are thinking about your father," she said gently. Naomi nodded. "Someone at work tells jokes almost exactly like his." Her mother looked pleasantly surprised. "Do they make you laugh?" "Every time," Naomi admitted. "Not because they are good, because they remind me that kindness can sound wonderfully ridiculous." Her mother smiled through shining eyes. "Then your father would be very happy. He always believed laughter was proof that hope was still alive." Late that evening, Naomi returned to Romano Manor carrying leftover soup, fresh rosemary, and a heart that somehow felt lighter than it had in months. She had no idea that, at almost the same hour, Gabriel Romano sat alone in his study reading through reports without turning a single page. His thoughts kept returning to one simple question he had never considered before. Why had one ordinary housekeeper understood his humor better than anyone else he had met in years? Neither of them realized that the answer had begun long before they ever crossed paths, shaped by a father who believed the simplest jokes could carry the greatest love, and by a daughter who had never forgotten the sound of laughing through difficult days. The first signs of change were so subtle that almost nobody believed they were real. Gabriel Romano still arrived in his study before sunrise, still reviewed contracts with remarkable discipline, and still expected excellence from everyone around him. Yet somewhere between meetings and morning coffee, the atmosphere inside Romano Manor began to soften in ways no renovation could ever accomplish. Employees noticed that he no longer hurried through breakfast as though every minute spent inside the mansion was a minute wasted. Instead, he occasionally paused beside the dining room windows, watching the gardens wake beneath the morning sun while birds settled across the old maple trees. One Tuesday morning, Naomi entered the breakfast room carrying a fresh pot of coffee just as Gabriel finished reading the business section of the newspaper. She quietly refilled his cup and prepared to leave when he looked toward the rain falling beyond the glass. "Well," he said with complete seriousness, "at least the clouds remembered to water the lawn. I was beginning to worry about the landscaping budget." Naomi laughed immediately, the sound bright enough to compete with the gentle rain tapping against the windows. Gabriel did not look surprised this time. Instead, he calmly stirred his coffee before asking, "Do all terrible jokes receive such generous reviews?" Naomi smiled as she placed the coffee pot back onto the silver tray. "Only the honest ones." That answer stayed with Gabriel long after she disappeared into the hallway. Honest ones. Nobody had ever described his humor that way before. For years, people either ignored his attempts or forced polite smiles because they believed that was expected. Naomi never seemed interested in pleasing him. She simply reacted with the same sincerity she showed everyone else. Throughout the following week, Gabriel found unexpected reasons to remain inside the mansion a little longer each day. Sometimes he reviewed reports in the library instead of downtown. Other afternoons, he answered phone calls from the sunroom overlooking the gardens. Officially, nothing had changed. Unofficially, every employee sensed that the house itself felt different whenever its owner stayed home. Harold even joked that the roses had started blooming longer because someone finally appreciated them. Mrs. Brooks noticed another change that surprised her even more. Gabriel had begun asking simple questions about the staff. He wanted to know whether the kitchen team had everything they needed before the holidays. He approved replacing several aging washing machines without waiting for anyone to request them. When the maintenance crew mentioned that one employee's son had earned a college scholarship, Gabriel quietly sent a handwritten note of congratulations. None of the gestures were extravagant, yet together they created something the mansion had quietly lacked for years. People no longer hurried through every hallway with anxious expressions. Conversations lasted a little longer. Smiles appeared. More naturally, Naomi observed these changes without connecting them to herself. She simply believed everyone was enjoying the arrival of autumn. During lunch breaks, she continued eating with the housekeeping staff, listening to Harold's stories about impossible squirrels stealing tomatoes from the greenhouse and laughing just as freely as she always had. Gabriel occasionally watched those moments from a second-floor window, hidden behind partially drawn curtains. He never interrupted. He simply listened to the sound that had become strangely rare in his own life. For the first time in years, success no longer felt measured only by signed contracts, expanding investments, or carefully planned schedules. Somewhere between a cup of coffee, a rainy morning, and one ordinary woman's effortless laughter, Gabriel Romano had begun discovering that a house filled with warmth was worth more than a mansion filled only with perfection. By the middle of October, Romano Manor no longer felt quite as untouchable as it once had. The marble floors still reflected every chandelier, the gardens were still trimmed with flawless precision, and the daily schedule continued with almost military accuracy, yet an invisible warmth had quietly settled into the estate. It became most noticeable whenever Naomi happened to be nearby. She never sought attention. In fact, she seemed to avoid it whenever possible. If Gabriel entered a room while she was working, she greeted him politely, finished her task, and continued on without lingering. She never looked for excuses to begin conversations. She never mentioned his wealth, his reputation, or the influence that surrounded his name. To Naomi, he was simply the owner of the house where she worked, deserving of the same respect she offered everyone else. That quiet consistency fascinated Gabriel more than he cared to admit. One afternoon, a luxury fashion consultant arrived with garment bags for an upcoming charity gala. The staff prepared the main sitting room while executives reviewed the evening schedule. As Naomi dusted a nearby bookshelf, one of the consultants glanced toward her and smiled politely before saying, "You must enjoy working here. Most people would do almost anything to get this close to someone as successful as Mr. Romano." Naomi smiled with equal courtesy but continued arranging the books. "I enjoy honest work," she answered. "That is what brought me here." The consultant laughed lightly. "Surely you have bigger ambitions than cleaning a mansion." Naomi carefully returned the final book to its place before replying. "My ambition is making sure my mother never has to worry about paying her bills again. Everything else can wait." The room grew unexpectedly quiet. Gabriel had entered through the opposite doorway just in time to hear her final sentence. He said nothing, allowing the conversation to continue naturally. The consultant, clearly embarrassed, attempted to recover with another smile. "Well, I suppose everyone dreams differently." Naomi nodded kindly. "That is what makes people interesting." She excused herself and carried her cleaning supplies into the hallway without another word. Gabriel watched her disappear around the corner before turning his attention back to the meeting, but his concentration never fully returned. Throughout the afternoon, her words echoed through his thoughts with surprising clarity. She had been handed a perfect opportunity to impress influential people, yet she had chosen honesty over appearance. She had not tried to elevate herself by standing beside him. She had elevated herself simply by remaining true to who she already was. Later that evening, Mrs. Brooks found Naomi replacing fresh towels in the guest wing. The consultant asked whether you would like a recommendation for another position, she said. Apparently someone at the gala is looking for private household staff, and the salary is almost double. Naomi paused only long enough to fold the final towel. That is generous, she replied. But I like it here. Mrs. Brooks looked surprised. Even with the longer hours? Naomi smiled softly. This house feels different lately. People smile more. Harold tells better jokes. Even breakfast seems quieter in a good way. It reminds me that difficult places can change. Unbeknownst to both women, Gabriel had stopped several steps away. After turning the corner, he heard every word without intending to. Standing alone in the softly lit hallway, he realized something that unsettled him in the gentlest possible way. Naomi Carter had never stayed because of the mansion, the reputation, or the paycheck alone. She stayed because she believed people and places could become better. And for the first time in many years, Gabriel Romano found himself hoping she was right. The annual Romano Foundation Autumn Gala arrived beneath a clear October sky, and by late afternoon the mansion had transformed into a place of quiet elegance. Fresh white orchids lined the entrance hall, soft piano music drifted through the grand ballroom during final rehearsals, and long tables shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers waiting for guests from across New York. Naomi spent the afternoon helping Mrs. Brooks prepare the reception rooms, carefully straightening linen napkins and polishing the final row of silver serving trays until each reflected the warm golden light above. She appreciated events like these because every detail mattered, yet every success belonged to the entire staff instead of any single person. As evening approached, luxury cars began arriving one after another. Business leaders, philanthropists, and longtime family friends stepped inside wearing tailored suits and elegant gowns, exchanging polished smiles and familiar greetings. Naomi quietly moved through the room offering refreshments, making certain every guest felt welcome before returning to the service corridor. Near one of the floral displays, two well-dressed socialites watched her pass. One leaned toward the other and spoke softly enough to sound discreet, but loudly enough for nearby employees to hear. "She seems awfully comfortable here," the woman remarked with an amused smile. "I suppose every grand house has someone who mistakes kindness for opportunity." The second woman glanced toward Naomi before replying. "Perhaps Mr. Romano should remember that employees are employees, no matter how charming they appear." Naomi heard every word. Her hands remained perfectly steady as she adjusted a serving tray, but a quiet sadness crossed her face. For only a brief moment before disappearing behind her usual calm expression. She had spent too many years learning that dignity often meant answering unkindness with silence. She simply excused herself and continued toward the refreshment station without acknowledging the remarks. Unfortunately for the two women, someone else had heard every sentence as clearly as Naomi had. Gabriel Romano had just finished greeting several board members when the conversation reached him across the ballroom. He walked toward the group without raising his voice or changing his expression. The surrounding conversations gradually faded as guests noticed him approaching. He stopped beside the floral arrangement where the two women still stood smiling politely, unaware that anything had changed. Gabriel looked at them with composed courtesy before speaking. "I believe there is something worth clarifying." The room grew remarkably still. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. "Character has never depended on a job title. The people who care for this home deserve the same respect as every guest who walks through these doors." Neither woman answered. Gabriel continued with the same measured confidence. "Success is not measured by who serves the meal. It is measured by how we treat the person serving it." Silence settled across the ballroom. Several guests lowered their eyes in quiet reflection, while others nodded almost imperceptibly. The two women offered embarrassed apologies before stepping away toward another conversation. Gabriel watched them leave, then turned toward the refreshment station where Naomi had quietly resumed arranging glasses as though nothing unusual had happened. Their eyes met for only a second. Naomi offered the same sincere smile she gave everyone, grateful but never triumphant, and gently nodded before continuing her work. Gabriel returned the smallest nod in acknowledgement before greeting another arriving guest. Around them, conversations slowly resumed, yet something fundamental had changed inside the ballroom. The evening was no longer remembered only for elegant decorations or distinguished visitors. It became remembered for a quiet reminder that respect could never be purchased, inherited, or displayed like fine jewelry. It was earned one ordinary act of kindness at a time, and somehow the grandest room in Romano Manor felt warmer than it had ever been before. Several days after the gala, life at Romano Manor settled into its familiar rhythm once again, but nothing truly felt the same. The grand hallways still echoed with measured footsteps, fresh flowers still brightened every room, and the clocks still marked each hour with perfect precision. Yet beneath the polished routine lived something new, something impossible to capture in financial reports or architectural drawings. The mansion no longer felt like a place where people simply worked. It had become a place where people belonged. On a quiet Friday morning, Naomi arrived early to replace the flowers in the breakfast room. Autumn had deepened across New York, painting the trees outside in shades of amber and crimson. She carefully arranged white lilies inside the crystal vase before stepping back to admire their balance. A familiar voice behind her broke the silence. "Do you think they are standing straighter because they know they are expensive?" Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second before laughing softly. She turned toward Gabriel, who stood beside the doorway holding his morning coffee with the same calm expression he always wore. "No, sir," she replied with a smile. "I think they are standing straighter because they are trying to impress the sun." Gabriel nodded thoughtfully, as though considering the answer with complete seriousness. "That explains why my roses never negotiate with the rain." Naomi laughed again, brighter than before, and gently shook her head. "Your jokes are getting worse." "I was told honesty deserves encouragement," Gabriel answered. "So I am practicing." For a moment, they simply stood there while warm morning light spilled through the tall windows, illuminating the marble floor with soft golden reflections. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful, the kind that exists only between two people who no longer feel the need to pretend. Naomi looked toward the flowers before asking the question that had quietly lived in her mind since the first morning they met. "May I ask you something?" Gabriel nodded. "Of course." She smiled with genuine curiosity. "Were the jokes ever meant to be funny?" Gabriel looked out toward the gardens where Harold was already tending the flower beds. His answer came slowly, carrying more truth than either of them expected. "Not really." Naomi waited. "Then why keep telling them?" He smiled, this time without trying to hide it. "Because you laughed." The room became wonderfully still. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment, touched by the unexpected honesty. She thought about her father, about countless ordinary mornings filled with impossible jokes and impossible hope. She realized that somewhere along the way those same simple moments had quietly found another home. Mrs. Brooks entered the hallway carrying fresh linens and paused just long enough to notice something she had never expected to witness inside Romano Manor. Gabriel Romano was smiling while discussing flowers with a housekeeper, and neither of them seemed aware that the moment itself was extraordinary. She quietly continued walking without interrupting. Some memories deserved to remain undisturbed. Months later, employees would remember that autumn not because of successful business deals or elegant charity events, but because laughter had finally found its way into a house built on discipline and perfection. Gabriel discovered that respect could open doors money never could. Naomi discovered that quiet kindness could change even the most guarded heart without asking for recognition. And on countless peaceful mornings that followed, another wonderfully terrible joke would drift across the breakfast room, followed almost immediately by one honest laugh that reminded everyone inside Romano Manor what a real home was always meant to sound like.